Well, hello and welcome to this new episode of A Few Minutes With. After taking a few months off to refresh and recharge, I'm excited to be back, and I'm excited to welcome back a very special guest who's no stranger to the podcast. Traci Rhoades has just released her new book, Shaky Ground, and it's an outstanding book. For those of you who are familiar with her first book, Those Who Are Wandering Spiritually Are Not Lost. This is a great follow-up to that, and it gives some wonderful tools and resources and ways of stabilizing and engaging and recharging your faith life when the world, as it is for so many of us, is shaky and unstable, and we don't know where we're going to be landing from one moment to the next. So Traci, it's wonderful to have you back. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and also just for your friendship online. It means a lot to me to have readers who get the message that I'm trying to put forth.
Well, thank you, and it's an honor to have your friendship as well. I was thinking, as you are my first returning guest on the podcast, I don't know for those listening or watching who are familiar, but on Saturday Night Live, they have a funny little club. I think it starts at the 5-time returning host club, where they have this fake lounge and fake jackets with crests that they give to the 5-time host. So I'm thinking with you, Traci, I might have to come up with some swag to give you as a returning guest.
I like it. Yeah.
Well, it's been about a year since we talked last. And at that point, you and your family and your community at North Point Church were starting to slowly emerge from the pandemic lifestyle. How's it been going for the last year for you all?
I think normal, which is the new normal, right? Yeah, we are pretty much back to a routine of gathering together on Sunday mornings. Our Bible studies are back in person, and school is in person without masks. So we are definitely feeling like the routine is being established. What I encounter, I say more at home maybe than in the church, although I could probably do some exploring and find that it's there as well. We just changed a little. We're a little more cautious about what we do, who we interact with. There's just kind of layers, especially right before we went on the air. You mentioned my daughter just started her freshman year of high school. And I think we do have groups of individuals, and those middle schoolers, high schoolers are certainly in that group, who are just wondering about the world, maybe in different ways, and more so than I did when I was a teenager. So yeah, just looking at a lot of those friendships and relationships that I have, and kind of gauging the emotional health, the spiritual health of those individuals. I find I'm doing that more than I did 2 years ago.
And certainly during this time, you took the opportunity to write this book. And for those watching, this is the cover. I highly recommend that you buy it. And as Traci knows me well, there's a lot of highlighting throughout. So highlighting and note taking. This partners very well, I think, with your first book. And as I was thinking about this, in some respects, you're a community builder, you're a Bible teacher, you're a writer, you do great online sessions, doing a chronological reading of the Bible each year. But in some respects, too, I think you're almost an explorer, because you're kind of diving in and swimming, for lack of a better analogy, the breadth and the depth of the ecumenical ocean. And that's all very present here. So to start with, if you were to get into an elevator and somebody gave you time to do an elevator summary or an elevator pitch of what Shaky Ground is about, how would you describe this?
I would describe it as what I have learned for myself as I explore all of our church traditions and spiritual practices that are new to me, and my desire to share what I've learned then with my readers, who can always also find something new in the wide expanse of capital C church. I use that term a lot in the book.
Yeah.
And spiritual practice. None of us have tapped into every spiritual practice that there is. So.
Well, and a lot of the spiritual practices here, and one thing I love, because I'm one that thrives on silence and not isolation per se, but having space. So much of this book is rooted in silence, the silence of different types of prayer, the silence in liturgies, the silence that you found in actual physical spaces that you've been through. Part of this, as I said, resonates deeply with me, because in my own life, space and silence have been important to me. You talk, for me, movingly about the transition away from the farm on which you grew up after your father had died, and the changes and the unexpected things about that. I lived on a farm for 4 years, and it's taken a process. We didn't own the farm, so when we left, it was a different type of transition.
Mm-hmm.
But, again, space and stillness matter so much to you. Where did that come from, do you think, in your life?
I think growing up in a space like that did a lot of it. You're being formed in ways that you probably don't even realize until you get away from it. I remember when I was in college, and then immediately following college, I lived for a few years in St. Louis, Missouri. And when I would come home to visit my mom, she was still living on the farm at that time. I would always run outside at night. And sometimes I would even drive up at night, depending on when I had left from where I was living. And I would stare at the stars. And she would say, "What are you doing? I didn't even know where you went." And I was like, they don't, and so I didn't have that where I was living at the time. And you sometimes don't miss something until you don't have it. And so I do think that was largely placed just inside of me from my formative years. And it was so interesting. And I think I wrote about this a little more in the first book, or maybe in some blog posts years ago. But whenever my husband and I started trying to have children and had our daughter, I knew almost instinctively I had to get back to the country, because I didn't know how to raise a city kid. I didn't know how to put a kid in a school of 2,000 students in her graduating class. I could have figured it out, but it wasn't my heart. It wasn't how I felt God leading me to parent. And so actually, if you look at it, my daughter has a pretty close upbringing to the one that I had.
Yeah. How much time do you think on it? Because I know you live on a farm, or a huge piece of property in Michigan now, that I think in some ways, and you write about this in some respects, that it not matches, but it kind of replicates that atmosphere of giving you that silence. How much time do you think on a day you're able to spend with all the other demands of your life and responsibilities in that silence and stillness?
Once school starts. If I don't, I do. My husband jokes it's my coffee ministry. I do meet up pretty regularly with different women to have coffee, to have lunch. There's kind of, I would say, 8 to 10 women that I kind of keep in rotation, and then there will be some new people from time to time. So I do have that on the calendar. But if there's a typical day at home, I spend the first couple hours of my day reading out of a prayer book. I also love to read poetry first thing in the morning. And then from there to the chronological Bible reading that you talked about. And 2 hours can go by pretty fast. I don't always have that luxury. And I know many, many people don't have it at all. But a couple hours doing that. And then from there, I can typically write. My best writing time is early morning to early afternoon. And so I would say I could probably go to about 2 or 3 doing that. So yeah, if you look at that time frame, that's 7 or 8 hours, I guess, before the world picks back up again and my daughter and husband come home. That would be a dream day, I guess, on the days that I'm writing. And it's so funny. And maybe it should go without saying, but I don't think I realized how true it was. If I'm going to write well and continue having ideas about what to write and continuing to process my thoughts, I need that quiet time with God in the morning, and I read a lot.
Yeah.
It all just kind of goes hand in hand.
Have you ever experienced, I call it the loudness of silence. I lived in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, for 20 years, and moving back to Central Virginia, where I was raised, I learned suddenly what silence was like. And birds are loud. The wind is loud. There's so much noise in the silence that I was missing. Do you find that sometimes you have that loud silence, or are you able at this point to actually live into true and genuine silence in those moments?
Couple responses to that. First, I think it depends on how long it's been since I've been in a moment of silence. Like I'm coming out now of summer vacation with my daughter, and we took different vacations and just having her in the house, adding little bits of conversation throughout the day. It'll take me a while to get back into the rhythm of just being comfortable in that silence without it being distraction. And then the second thing, it depends on what I'm doing. When I joke, when I'm writing, the refrigerator is too loud. Like I have got to have it so very quiet. I cannot imagine people that go to like a coffee shop or a restaurant, to do their writing. That's just not the way that I accomplish it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it depends on how regularly I've been in silence and what I'm doing in that silence.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, turning again to other parts of the book, there are a lot of lines that jumped out at me, but one that resonated particularly with me was when you wrote that healing has layers.
Yeah.
And as you're writing through this book, or writing the chapters that go together in this book, were you doing a bit of your own healing? Was this not an exercise necessarily, but did you find that there were moments when you were writing that you realized the writing, even for the benefit of others, was actually benefiting you in some way and healing that you felt you needed to do?
I think the type of writing that I do, which I call nonfiction narrative, it can leak into memoir sometimes, is all about that. I often joke, I don't know what I think until I write it out. And I would also add to that, which kind of surprised me, but now I'm used to the process. I've had the same editor for both books, and she's been a delight. Has really, I feel like, gotten to know my voice and know that can be a pro and a con because she knows when I'm holding back. And oftentimes, some of the healing has layers is one of them. Some of the parts of the book that feel very raw, she found. She said, you need to expand on this or tell me more about this situation. And what I find is when I go back to do those edits, tears come.
Yeah.
Because I know that she has hit on a part of my story that I was maybe hesitant to write. One thing that I come up against often when I'm writing and the style of writing that I do, I don't want to be misunderstood, and I don't want something that has affected me to appear overly negative because I'm
Yeah.
not really a critical person. And that's not why I write. And I'll give you an example. I share a story. I don't remember what chapter it's in, but my in-laws called me one day and said that they had invited our pastor to come to their church or to their home for dinner. And that's a pretty normal thing. Like my father-in-law is an elder. And so not all that unusual to socialize, with the pastor, especially just to have a nice casual dinner. And immediately tears sprung to my eyes. And the dinner didn't end up happening. The schedule didn't work out. But when I got off of the phone with them, I thought, why did that upset me so much? Well, over the years, we too have tried to have our pastor over for just a social gathering. And for various reasons, it hasn't happened. He likes me. I don't think it's that. But healing has layers, right? So I sat in silence for a while and thought, what, take that all the way back, right, in your mind. And that's what I encourage people to do a lot in this book. If you have a strong reaction to something, why? Because it's often, like I say, who cares? They invited the pastor to dinner. Well, what I realized was, and it's a very common theme that I have known in my life that is a part of my story. The enemy can tell me sometimes that I am not a good enough church member because my dad didn't go to church and I don't come from a whole perfect Christian family. And I know all of us don't, but my dad had a profound influence on my faith. I can't help my poor mom, my parents were divorced when I was a young adult. And then my father passed away maybe 3 or 4 years after the divorce. And so she has her own story about her relationship with my dad. And so it can be difficult sometimes for her to read my books because she can sympathize with what I experienced and how I have processed that and healed from that, how you continue to heal from those situations. And God uses all of it. I think that's the beauty of it. I loved my dad. I get into that later in the book. He shows up, I think, 3 times maybe throughout the book. But I acknowledge the complications that came with that and have asked God to let that strengthen and develop my faith instead of hinder it.
I'm glad you brought up that particular story because that was one that jumped out at me, and it made me spend some time thinking about what we as not just clergy, lay leaders, congregations, what can we do? And this is a question I'll put to you. What can we do to build up people who, similar to you being led internally to feel incorrectly that the reason the pastor wasn't coming to your house was because your dad couldn't go to church? What can we do to build up people who feel like they don't belong in a church because they're not enough? They don't come from the right place. Their own background is sketchy. Just the old hymn that I love, "Just as I am." How can we remind people, or what can we do more of to remind people that they are enough? They're exactly who they need to be when they walk through the door of the church or the Bible study or something like that.
It's so hard at the beginning. The people that you're describing that are, the names that are coming to my mind as you describe that kind of person is a new believer or a newcomer to church. And it doesn't have to be, but that's who came to mind. And so much of my healing is behind the scenes. The hours and hours that I read scripture and that God and I take prayer walks and I sit in silence with him. And our society doesn't feed that well. I think oftentimes individuals think they can go to church And sometimes they even think, if I go for an hour on Sunday morning, I should be becoming a better person. And it helps, it's not to say stop doing that, but the more you plug in to church as a community, and the more you have your one-on-one time with God, he does that healing.
Mhm.
And so the main thing we can do is encourage that, and share resources and books that encourage that. And that's certainly a large part of what I wanted to do with Shaky Ground. There's one side where, okay, my bottom just dropped out. What do I do?
Yeah.
And I think these spiritual practices will be very comforting in those moments. But those moments are less severe and less earth-shattering if we have already been doing these spiritual practices to have a healthier spirit, to be spiritually connected to God, so that when the bottom drops out, he doesn't. Our foundation is still our habits are still there, our disciplines are still in place. And that can be a hard thing to teach. Like I say, it's not the world's way,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just had a gal on Instagram. I shared a board on Instagram that said, I'm learning that people who have been older people in the faith, so people who have been a Christian for a long time, can often weather these storms so well because they've seen God come through again and again.
Yeah.
And if you're young and you're a new Christian, you haven't experienced that as much. But if you stay faithful, and I'm almost 50, my mom is almost 70, we've seen God come through again and again in our family, in the pieces that came from that family experience. And that's where faith develops. But it's not fast.
Yeah. And I think too, and you write throughout, I'm thinking specifically of writing about going to a Russian Orthodox liturgy and having somebody there explaining to you what's going on. You've talked about experiences in Catholic churches where people are walking you through the liturgy and that sort of thing. Welcome is such a huge component of that. And you write about welcome that's done well in so many places. Have you seen the opposite, where people come and they're trying to have that added layer of a spiritual life that they're building up through regular prayer and reflection and that sort of thing, and then they come to a church to try it and the welcome is almost non-existent? I know you write about the good, but have you seen the not so good and the welcome too, and maybe how that impacts different people?
I think you're picking on the evangelical church.
Not at all. Believe me, this is across the board. I have
The reason why I say that is because what do we offer, right? I mean, week after week we gather together, and if I see those new people, I'll say hi.
Mhm.
But every service is different. We never, like, here's a very easy example to make my point. If I went to Catholic Mass, or a highly liturgical Episcopalian church, it doesn't matter the tradition, for 6 months straight,
Mhm.
I would probably have memorized some prayer of humble access, the Apostles' Creed.
Mhm.
If it was Orthodox, I probably in 6 months I probably said the Jesus Prayer 1,100 times. So these things that I have come to believe settle in our hearts and in our
Mhm.
minds, and they're a resource that then we can pull up whenever things get shaky and we're wanting to remember how to connect with God. Now, some of our contemporary churches, and I attend one, not at all saying that they shouldn't exist. I'm just saying here's a way that maybe my church and those churches could do it better. Give them something that is a regular rhythm that they know they're going to encounter every Sunday,
Yeah.
And for an example, I've been to several churches that I have belonged to over the years, contemporary, who end with the priestly blessing. Numbers 6:24 through 26, if I remember correctly. And that's something that we could hold on to and lock into. I find that so often a lot of our churches have this unhealthy fear of repeating things because they think it'll just become rote. It'll become just a monotonous. And I just am not convinced of that anymore. Yes, of course, I use an example in one of my writings. I've known John 3:16 probably since I was 4 years old. And if I say John 3:16 slowly and meditatively and reflectively, wow, that's a beautiful, beautiful promise, a beautiful verse to hold on to. But I could also say it because I've known it for years and years and years, in probably a faster time than you can. So let's have a contest. I mean, these are the differences. So I think anytime any of our churches can give people something that is going to carry into their everyday life, and not even something they have to conjure up, but something that is there because it's been, and that takes me, it can also talk and process at the same time too, apparently. That takes me back to the churches I grew up in when we were singing the hymns on a regular basis. And I one of my favorite things about my writing process is how often hymns bubble up. they're, and I'm sure for an Episcopalian who has used passages for 40 years from the Book of Common Prayer, they would have a similar experience with those words. They're the words that have just always been in us. And so that would lead me to encourage church leadership to ask the question, what do we have for people to latch onto now? And do we? Because we're not singing those hymns anymore. My daughter doesn't know them. And typically a praise and worship song, we only sing for 2 to 3 months and then we're on to the next ones.
Right.
So it's an important thing to consider.
That's a good reminder to me, what do we have to latch onto? Because, so many people have told me I love coming here because of the feel of the space or the liturgy or the familiarity. But do we have enough things to latch onto? And you talk about the hymnal. And I love how you write about the hymnal that you had even as a child that you still have. And in some respects, it's almost become, I viewed it the way you wrote about it, almost as a mini tabernacle, because there are such important prayers. I think you wrote out one of the creeds and you keep it in there. You talk about the hymns. So I love that almost, even as you write about tabernacles in the traditional sense in the altar area with the bread and the wine, because of the importance of the hymnal, it's almost a mini tabernacle because it carries such important things for you that you've placed in there over the course of your life. So
yeah, and for those people, and I don't know that they would be your listeners, but they certainly exist within Christianity. Those people who hesitate to embrace a spiritual practice like praying a rosary, or for the Orthodox using a prayer rope. What undid that barrier for me was realizing what emotions I felt as I held my Baptist hymnal.
Yeah.
Because it was about so much more than just something you pulled out, and probably dropped when I was a little kid on a Sunday morning. The words in there really are the cry of my heart. And even, I remember when we switched. Oh, I was probably 12, let's say, whenever the little country church I attended switched from that old green hymnal to a new brown one. And I never liked it. that wasn't even the right color for a hymnal. And then also, when my father passed away in 2006, it was very sudden, and I lived about 10 hours away at the time. And so quickly, my husband and I packed some clothes in a bag and headed to Missouri. And my in-laws live about 3 hours closer than we did at the time.
Mhm.
And so we stopped there overnight because it was late at night, and then we would have finished the drive in the morning. And when I got to my in-laws, I realized I had forgotten my Bible in the mad rush to get out the door. And so I asked my father-in-law if I could use his. And again, just holding the Bible. I did flip to the Psalms, couldn't tell you what I read. But there's something to be said for those tangible ways that we engage with our faith too.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy thinking about that, because that's a pretty new concept for me.
Yeah. And I know the Psalms mean a lot to you. You've referenced Psalm 23 in your writing. You've referenced Psalm 121. You talk about services where silence is incorporated even between the Psalms. So I know the Psalms resonate, and that is the hymn book of the Bible,
Yeah.
and it's the easiest read. Rather than digging through John trying to find something, you can almost let the Psalms fall open to any one, and there's going to be something that resonates with you. On the issue of silence again, and I'm sorry I keep going back to this, but it's such a powerful thing in this book.
Before you do,
Sure.
I want to point out the fact, if you happen to have listeners who have listened both times, in my first book, Not All Who Wander Spiritually Are Lost, you told me that I kept hitting on Ash Wednesday.
Yes.
A lot, and you saw that theme throughout. And what did that mean to me? And so now you're seeing silence. So I was kind of curious, actually, when I knew we were going to speak again, if there was a recurring theme that you saw. So, but I would agree with you. Silence is pretty heavy in this one.
Well, and it's a good thing, and it's good for people that are reading your book, that don't have the luxury of a life where they can slow down enough. This is a way of them feeling a bit of silence and living vicariously through you. So I think that's one of the great gifts of this. You write about Brent Bill, Quaker pastor, who inserted silences into the services that his congregation did, and he told them, if things don't move as quickly as you think they should, don't panic. Everything's fine. It's coming. A few weeks ago in the lectionary, when the Mary and Martha story came up with Jesus, I was trying to make the point that we want people to stop living like Martha and running around and spend some time like Mary. So my sermon actually ended with 2 minutes of silence. I just stepped out of the 2 minutes. I stepped out of the pulpit. I told them it was coming. I stepped out of the pulpit and I went and sat in my chair, and I could feel coming from the congregation a mixture of, I think, a little bit of confusion, a little bit of uncertainty. There was some apprehension, and I'm sure people were fidgeting. One person told me after the service, was that 2 minutes? It felt like 10. But with that, the experiences you've had, and again, you have a different approach to silence, but what do you remember about being in services where there's been a very intentional working in of silence into the liturgy, maybe even in places where it wasn't expected? And what did you sense in yourself and in the people around you?
The first time that I recall really noticing the silence was at an Ash Wednesday service. And I wept. I love a sanctuary. I mentioned that in the book too. I'm just a church girl through and through. And so for that priest to take moments throughout the service for us just to sit in the spirit-filled sanctuary was completely new to me.
Yeah.
That is not the church services I have known. I've sat in sanctuaries before, but not during a service has there been that kind of silence. And then, I don't know, maybe a year later, I was at a Methodist church in my little hometown, or my little town. And the pastor, after he collected the offering, walked in silence to the front and lifted it up, kind of like Simba gets lifted up in the Lion King, right? Like, here's an offering, a dedication, if you will. And I didn't cry that time, but I remember thinking, this allows for so much spiritual work to be done. And then where two or three gather together, I am with them, right? Well, it made me question, and I unpack this in the book. How often do we two or three gather together and make so much noise that we don't even get to hear what he has for us in the gathering? And then I share about a time that our worship leader did try to implement some silence, and it was awkward. So we haven't done that since, and so I share that. I mean, prepare for it to be awkward. And, in your case, that 2 minutes felt like 10 for one individual, so we don't do this, we think we're silent. And I'm fortunate in that God has preordained for me to have a tremendous amount of silence in my everyday life. But it's accessible for anyone. You get in the car and you just don't turn on the radio, or you don't turn on the, this podcast. You listen to it next time you get in the car, and I share, and I'm not going to remember. I don't know how to say his last name. It's Traci Rhoades. It's Villodas. I share a story from his first book, and he lived in New York City and was in the hustle and bustle. And he talked about the different noises that he heard outside of his window, which are completely different from what I hear outside of mine. But shared that he was silence is also a state of mind. Yes. Silence is also what you've decided to shut out. It's, putting on headphones, and maybe you even, we have 10 million apps accessible to us on the phone, on our phones. Maybe we find an app that's the wind or the ocean, and just put on your headphones so you don't hear the other things. And all you hear is that. And there's your silence for 2 minutes that will feel like 10 at first, I think I just really felt very strongly after writing the book, and even the years leading up to it, that we need to be very intentional about that silence. And I deeply appreciate how the Quakers have created that experience in their tradition.
And there's even a different tradition. As I was starting to read this, you actually headed a different direction. There are also the Quaker meetings where you come in and nobody says anything, and you sit in utter silence until somebody is led to speak. So if nobody's led to say anything, it could be 1 hour of just sitting in silence. I've never experienced that. I've had friends that have and have talked about it. Talk about something that for people are not comfortable with silence, going in and sitting and waiting and waiting and waiting for something to happen that may not happen in the time that you're together is an even bigger shock to the system for some folks.
Yeah.
I want to throw one thing at you to try this. I learned this in seminary, in the Book of Common Prayer. If you go to the Psalter, you notice that halfway through each verse of the Psalm, there's an asterisk. And most churches you've probably been to in the Episcopal or Anglican tradition, that's where they either alternate between the priest and the congregation, or they switch from left to, sometimes the left side of the room reads the first part. But in seminary, I had a professor encourage us to use the asterisk as a break and actually have a moment of silence within each verse of the psalm. So you start the psalm, you hit to the asterisk, and you just stop. And even for a couple of seconds, and then you read the second part. So if you've not tried that, space between psalms is one thing. Space within the psalm itself is an entirely different dynamic.
Yeah. Now I'm thinking back. Is it Selah? Is that how you say it? Selah?
Yes. Hmm.
That's incorporated into certain ones of the Psalms. And my understanding of that translated word is that it's intended to be silence.
Yes.
So now I'm thinking maybe I'm curious if we kind of pulled from the Jewish tradition that concept and have incorporated it with an asterisk.
And
Yeah.
we're so reluctant to do it because, like you said, you write about the race. I can say the 23rd Psalm faster than you can to get to the end before you can. The same thing with Psalms. It's like, and I can even hear in congregations that I visited where the priest has one cadence, and then you hear different cadences throughout because everybody's, some are reading, some are listening to the priest, some are just charging through. And so putting them in a position where you may be doing the psalm at a different pace, but at this moment, you all have to stop and you all have to live into the silence, even if it's just for a breath.
It's a collective breath. I
Yes.
love that. I love that. Yeah. And I think that would be very forming for a community.
So talk to me. You write about some retreats that you went on as well, some where you explored almost Ignatian spiritual exercises and reflecting on readings and where you see yourself, what you feel, what you sense, what you can smell. I mean, there's some wonderful ways of doing this. But in those moments of silence, as you're reflecting on this, and you talk a little in the book about this, but I wonder if you talk a bit more about in those silences, hearing God. So often people have say, have you ever heard God? Well, it depends on what you think God says, but talk a little bit about some of the experiences that you've had where in that silence, the loudness of God suddenly comes in.
Well, I will preface every experience with saying those moments of deep Bible study, like if I'm writing or preparing to teach, those so like intense, or the Ignatian approach to it's got a name, but I can't think of it right now. To reading scripture.
I was going to say examine, but that's something different.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of contemplative reading, and it might. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
It's in the book. If you want to know what it is, buy the book. Right. It's in there.
What I explore in the book. Or we can put it in the notes. We don't mean to tease. But anyway, every time I spend that kind of intentional, deep study or interaction with scripture, I'm just a gratefulness washes over me. We're so loved by God. I haven't ever used it in my writings because in the movie they cuss a lot, so I don't think I can promote it, but I can talk about it. In Good Will Hunting, it's Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. Matt Damon is a character who experienced a tremendous amount of abuse in his childhood and is now a full-fledged functioning adult who carries a lot of wounds and also happens to be a math prodigy. And so this fact about him is discovered, but he's not able to step into it in any way that's healthy and, leading to career opportunities or what have you, because he's held up by these deep, deep wounds that he has from childhood. So he starts meeting with a therapist, Robin Williams, and there is one scene that is a key breakthrough for him. And he and Robin Williams are in the office, for their therapy appointment. And Robin Williams says to him, "It's not your fault." And he's like, "I know, nobody, whatever." And he's like, "It's not your fault." And he says it probably 8 different times and never changes his cadence, his tone, just it's not your fault. And Will, has a few expletives because he's really getting down to a deep, deep healing, a deep thing that Will needs to hear. And gosh, I could so easily transfer that idea to God loves us. Like, I will say it to you 8 times, and maybe it will start to penetrate in a deeper, different way. God loves us. And I think that is the first thing that happens to me every time I spend that kind of intentional space
Hmm.
with him. And then from there, I'm such a learner, an incredibly curious person. And I feel like he teaches me something new every single time. And it might not even be like, oh, that's what that Hebrew word means. It may not be new, academically. It
Hmm.
may not be new something, but a new way to connect with him, or a new practice that I haven't tried yet that I should. Or I shared on Twitter just this morning when I first woke up. um my daughter's starting her freshman year, and she is full of drama, and the emotions are kind of up and down and nervous, and
Hmm.
a mama dads do too, but this mama really carries that when she's going through those things. And I just knew when I woke up, I was like, my routine's going to have to change a little bit today, because I need to read a formal prayer
Yeah.
that just really felt like something that would ground me. I called it partnering words in the tweet. I'd already prayed to God, asking him, to give my daughter a good day, and to calm her emotions, and all of those things. And I turned to the daily devotions in the Book of Common Prayer,
Hmm.
and there was a collect at the end. And the first thing it says is, "Thank you for bringing me into this day safely."
Yeah.
Um, so it has been very transformative for me to welcome new things like that into my faith walk. Because I would have grown up, probably at one time would have even said out loud, I don't need the Book of Common Prayer. I have a Bible,
Hmm.
right? Like I've learned so much about how all of these different things can just be a part of our ever growing faith.
Yeah.
They're not, and for me, nothing replaces the Bible. Nothing has ever replaced Scripture,
Hmm.
but I have added to. The richness has grown because I have also included, and that's certainly the point I try to make in the book.
Well, and as you were talking just now, you mentioned, uh, I think the word you used was how things resonate with you. And you seem to be, and you're right about that, but you seem to be a very Lectio Divina style, not just prayer, but reflector in all of these things and how things resonate and jump out at you differently. And, this book in its own way, with the types of liturgies that you cover, the various prayer practices, you even include a chapter on what for most is traditionally a Catholic practice of praying for intercession from Mary, the Mother of God, Catholic and Orthodox. Um, but the whole book, there's this little Lectio thread that winds through it, because I know you've tried to share practices, and there is a bit of, as you said, it goes into a bit of memoir along the way, but there are these little moments of Lectio, even as you're reading it, where you wrote about, again, Psalm 121, the opening verses. And that jumped out at me because I just learned that I had completely been misunderstanding the first two verses of that psalm for all these years. And then when I on some Sundays, I'll preach on a psalm. If the gospel just isn't hitting me, I'll preach on a psalm. And so I had just learned something new about the 121st psalm that I didn't know. And so that was a Lectio moment where if that hadn't happened, what you wrote wouldn't have popped out. So your book, to me, has a very Lectio Divina feel to it.
Yeah, I could see that. And I think that's the writer in me.
Hmm.
You start to see these threads, and like it's a calling attention, if you will, to a concept that then you're like, oh, now I need to spend some time thinking through that. And you mentioned early in the interview um that so much of my writing and my space online seems it, I don't come to you as an expert. I'm not educated with a seminary degree.
Mm-hmm.
I am not a scholar. I cannot read one word in Greek or Hebrew, but I love to share what I learn.
Mm-hmm.
And in sharing that, I'm processing it, and I think that's why I've met with some nominal success on a place like Twitter, because everybody on Twitter thinks they're an expert and they'll tell you so.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
um, a- and I truly come, if you are a person who's naturally curious and always wanting to learn more and more about the things that interest you, I can't recommend Twitter enough, because there's so many smart people there. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, one gentleman is a professor like in the Netherlands. Like, when am I ever going to meet a professor in the Netherlands? And I can ask a question, and if he pipes in, then I have this perspective I never could have gotten any other way. I mean, you can't read enough books to cover the places and traditions and ethnicities, et cetera, that you find in a social media space. So I've learned to use it well. I've learned to use it to my advantage. But then other people come along and can reap those benefits too.
Yeah, I was going to say they definitely benefit, because sometimes you may be asking questions that people want to ask, and for whatever reason, fear or not wanting to be ridiculed or whatever personal expectations or fears they have within themselves, you're asking questions that they might not have. And I think that's one reason why your community is built up so much, because you're being I referred to you earlier as an explorer of the ecumenical ocean. You're doing this sort of exploration that they're afraid to, and it gives them the courage and the confidence to do that sort of thing.
Well, and somehow created a space where people know that's what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
Absolutely.
I will have so many people in their response to a question say, I know this is your place, and so I know the heart behind what you were asking. And I have a lot of private messages.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not willing to say this in a public space, but they'll share it with me.
Sure.
And I'm so honored. And you're absolutely right. People are asking these questions. I'm just trying to create a space where I can ask it and we don't get beat up verbally or otherwise.
Yes. And that's, I'm glad that you are highlighting the benefits of building a community like this on Twitter, because it does, in very powerful ways, compensate for, unfortunately, I pulled up Twitter this morning and I was just getting beat over
There
the
are other
head.
things going on.
And it was just like, oh, I already want to turn this off. Now, Twitter does give us the advantage of creating lists, so you can curate what you see, so you can turn it on and then go to your list, and you're only seeing what you want to see. But I'm one of many that's grateful for this community that you've built, and you curate, and you give people the space to come and talk. You give the space to come, and you've got 30,000 followers now, and I know not everybody's chiming in. You're giving them a space to be silent and just soak in what's going on. So I'm grateful for that.
Thank you. Thanks.
One of the stories you tell in the book, and this probably was one of the most powerful chapters. You talk about an interview you did with a podcaster named Kevin, and what came out from his own experience and his own pain that he was carrying, that came out in a way that you said very truthfully made you uncomfortable as you were having this conversation. And you asked the question, is the gospel good news for everybody? And how, with these things going on, how can we walk alongside somebody or walk alongside one another when they're carrying this and try and fix it, or knowing that we can't fix it? Have you thought more about that since you're writing? Because it resonated with me, because I learned in my chaplaincy internship and seminary, we're not supposed to be fixers. You can't be a fixer. Sometimes presence is the most important thing. So I wonder if you've thought about the fact that in the question you're also giving us the answer, whether you were aware of it when you wrote it or not. How do we walk alongside when we can't fix it? But the answer is we walk alongside. And that just jumped out, and I don't know if you've had a chance to reflect more on that since you finished the book or not. So
yeah, I think about it all the time, actually, because especially in my ministry at my local church, um, individuals, and for me, I do minister primarily to women, but individuals who I'm thinking of in my mind right now who have had a harder life
mhm,
than me,
yeah,
who have scars I can't even fully empathize with,
mhm,
and wanting to help them. And so yes, I do think about it a lot. And you're absolutely right. Presence is huge. Um, if I have this practice of whenever a person loses a loved one, I will go in my calendar on my phone and mark a year out
mhm,
from that date. Or if I know the birthday of the deceased, I will
mm,
mark that down because I remember from losing my dad, those first especially
yeah,
are brutal. Those are hard days.
mhm,
And I don't preach a sermon. I might share a Bible verse or I might not. Mainly, I just say, thinking of you today. And I
mhm,
remember them. Maybe there's a funny story or a cute story that you can share about that individual. Again, that ongoing presence. And then I would add to that, and I think this comes out in the chapter as well. And you're right. My editor kept telling me, don't wrap things up with a pretty bow. I love to do that. That's my favorite, because God's going to do that right
yeah,
at the end. Um, and so I didn't in that chapter. I intentionally tried not to conclude, but the conclusions were there.
mhm,
Presence is one, and secondly, lead them to Jesus.
yeah,
And if you're a person of the Jewish faith who is not a Christian, lead them to God.
mhm,
Um, because one thing that Kevin has shared with me, we did an interview after I asked permission to use that chapter, just to kind of talk about where we were now. Kevin's
mhm,
just a very much a deep thinker like I am. So we always have good conversations. And um, basically, what came out in those conversations is that regardless of how horrific the situation was, and the fact that so much of Kevin's life doesn't have good answers of why did it
mhm,
happen, the times that he has experienced the presence of God or Jesus in his life, I don't want to say they make it worth it, but they make it tolerable.
yeah,
They're meaningful, deeply meaningful to him, those touches by God. And now as a believer, as a Christian, he can regularly experience those times with God. And they're what we want to offer. They're
yeah.
what we go for ourselves, when times are shaky. We want those touches from God, his presence.
Yeah, and I think you write somewhere, and I'm paraphrasing this, I know horribly, but I think what you wrote was you'll know the voice of God when you hear it, or you'll know the presence of God when you feel it. And again, I'm paraphrasing this horribly, but it's in there, and that ties together so well with what you were just saying. Um, One of the things you wrote towards the end of the book is if you're unable to do church as you have in the past, ask God to help you reshape your image of church. And you talk about the things that North Point did so well, liturgies online, Bible studies online. You talk about the pre-recorded communion videos that your pastor did where you could participate in your own way, in your own home. But it's not the same as in person. And you even talk about it at the end of the day, it's about gathering as community. One of the things I noticed during Zoom was the people that were just resistant to any of it. I'm not logging in because it's not church. I'm not doing this because it's not church. And they're forgetting the fact that you're still gathering a community. You're also forgetting the church isn't necessarily about what you get. It's about what you bring. So if you're in a situation where you're confronted by someone who doesn't like the way, out of necessity or out of a desire to change and adapt and reach more people, the church is being reshaped, what would you encourage them in particular to look at or to consider as you're doing that, as they're raising those concerns / complaints?
Well, if I spoke quickly before asking the Holy Spirit, I would probably say church isn't about you, right?
Mm-hmm.
We are so, and I include myself 100% in this. We are so individualistic.
Yeah.
It's almost an impossible hat to take off as an American. We just think everything should go according to our plan for us and for our comfort and our happiness and our etc. So that would be my first thought. But if you want to look at it more from a historical standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
we don't look anything like the New Testament church I read in Acts either.
No.
Not truly. No. We don't know anything about what a hired full-time pastoral role looked like because it didn't exist back then. They were largely bivocational. Paul was a church planter. Timothy and Titus were maybe what you could call pastors. And then you move it further into church history. If you want to get a feeling for what it might have been like in the early first century, visit the Orthodox because they are still largely holding to those traditions. And then if you want to know what it was like to move Western with that concept, visit the Catholics. So that has been incredibly helpful for me to stop trying to put church in a box.
Yeah.
It has to be done this way or it's not church. I remember I can't remember what book it was of Francis Chan's, but I remember reading a book by Francis Chan, and he started this wildly successful mega church, maybe out in California, and he walked away from it and he went back to his home country for some time. And whenever he came back, it was like a sabbatical, if you will. It wasn't like a permanent move.
Yeah.
And whenever he came back, he and his wife started a house church. And church looked really different for them during that period of their life. And I'm not sure. He wrote an excellent book called Until Unity. I will plug that because it was very much on finding some ecumenism. Ecumenism, that you can be comfortable with.
Right.
Because I'm pretty darn comfortable with it. But that's been 9 years growing. And his argument was even little things like, can we go to the same conference and can I share a stage with a progressive person when I'm a conservative? So just lots of things to think through in that book. But I think that would be my encouragement is let's realize that churches look different in a lot of ways over the centuries. And what it really is a gathering, right? And then if you want to take that one step bigger, that's your local church experience. And when you consider the larger body of Christ and consider, a Chinese family who goes to church with threat of persecution, or a African. I am on a board that supports leadership mission work in Africa. And I know there's a lady in Nigeria who would get on her bike and didn't have childcare. So she would load up her 3 or 4 children also on the same bike. And they would ride for like 14 miles to the seminary where she was attending school. So again, still probably getting to that point that church isn't about us. But there are lots and lots and lots of examples that we can give of why that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I can actually offer one back in the Episcopal Church in previous years when there were parishes and dioceses that broke away and joined the more conservative branch of the Anglican Communion, and property was seized and court battles were going. There were churches that when they lost the church, members of the congregation for the remaining congregation that had a home large enough were hosting morning prayer and Eucharist in their living rooms and their dining rooms. And
very cool.
They weren't happy about it, but I think in hindsight, they reflected on the fact that was probably much closer to the church of Paul in the first century than they're ever going to get, unless they intentionally decide to do that again. So even in an unintentional way, and something that was thrust upon them more than something that they asked to do, they were having that experience. And even at North Point, I can remember you talking about the fact that it wasn't very traditional in the sense that every Sunday you took the sanctuary down and you put everything away. And then the next week you'd come in and build it and put it back. And I can remember thinking, and I think we talked about then, not only did it make church even more participatory than just the liturgy, but everybody was a church builder and everybody had a stake in it. So I think that you're right. There's some really, really wonderful examples out there, that grow out of the most diverse set of circumstances.
Yeah. And I think that probably the best advice that you could offer to those people who are offering suggestions about what they think of church is to encourage them to pray and ask God to show them how this is a good thing. God, how are you at work in this situation? Because we're facing circumstances now where there's still lots and lots of church attenders who are not back in the pews.
Yep. Oh yeah.
Virtual church has made it pretty easy to just go to church from your couch. And if we're in regular conversation with God, he will guide that conversation. He will let you know if it's time. I remember, I don't know, it's probably been 6 months now. Tish Harrison Warren wrote a New York Times column basically saying you need to get back to church. And she was blasted because everyone had a story about someone who couldn't go to church because they're immunocompromised or, they're elderly. And yes, and honestly, I was so frustrated with both the Times and with Tish because I was like, all you needed was one sentence that said, we realize that there are extenuating circumstances that do legitimately keep people from a regular weekly church experience. This isn't about that. And her message would have resounded. Instead, what we got was a very, very critical mass of people who saw what wasn't there.
And it made Tish
instead of the heart of the message.
Yeah, and it made Tish come across, you mentioned earlier, the fact that we're a very individualistic society. And it made that come across as her very individualistic, everybody else, is irrelevant at this point. This is what I think. And you're right, adding that one sentence would have brought everybody. And
here's what works for my family.
Yeah, absolutely.
So sad.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and a good editor and I mean, I actually cite Tish in this current book. Her writing's beautiful, and she is a sound teacher and a sound preacher. That I have no doubt where her heart was in that article. So it should have been caught.
Yeah. Let me ask you this: when you finished writing this book, Shaky Ground, was there something that, as you typed the last few words and then you started looking back at everything, or even when the galley started coming back for you to review, was there something in there that jumped out at you as being completely unexpected, something that you had no idea at all would have been in there when you started writing the book? Was there something about the process that surprised you as far as what went in?
Um, I'm continue to be surprised at how much my dad comes up in my writing. Like I say, I've just had to accept the fact that he's a huge part of my faith, even though I'm not sure he had his own faith, or what that looked like. And so, I remember my mom asking me, "Is your dad in this one as much as the first one?" And I'm like, "No, well." So, so he is he comes up a lot, which still surprises me. And then this book takes a bit of a twist at the end. My editor certainly thought it was a twist because I had to justify it to her. Many of the spiritual practices are built around the idea of prayer, of scripture, of silence. So like if I were to ask you, what is a spiritual practice? These are things that you would know about, and if you are a person well-versed in Christianity, you've probably come across a lot of them. Much of the first part of the book is me interacting with them as a person who is new to them, as a person who is exploring. But then at the end of the book, I wrote about the creeds, gave a little bit of history, very, very brief. And I wrote about the catechisms.
Yes.
And again, the history behind those. And going back to the part of the conversation where we talked about needing something to latch onto, that's why I consider those spiritual practices. Because I could ask a Dutch reformer to quote for me Catechism number 1, what is my only hope in what is my only comfort in death and in life, that I am not my own, etc. That there's more to it. I don't have it memorized. And they could rattle that off. Well, what struck me and what probably really started that chapter on the catechism is I was telling my pastor about this latest book concept and what I was writing. And he shared a story that I share in the book about ministering to an older generation. And when they're perhaps nearing the end of their life or ill in the hospital, those kinds of situations, if he knows their background and he knows where they came from, he will put his arm around that individual's head. And I remember him tearing up, ever so slightly as he told the story, because it was so touching. And he will whisper to them, "What is your only comfort in life and in death?" And I thought, there's more to those catechisms than just, you're going to learn the 10 commandments. Commandment number 1 says, thou shalt not kill, and so that's where I explored them and the angle that I took, because especially for the Heidelberg, for whatever reason, I tried to find the same kind of connection with the Westminster on the Presbyterian side and didn't quite. I think that Heidelberg question and answer number 1 in particular has crossed traditions. And that takes me back, it's funny to think about how much we all love C.S. Lewis, because theologically, a lot of us probably didn't agree with C.S. Lewis didn't even agree with himself 10 years apart. And so I think the spiritual practices that I mentioned here, and even towards the end of the book, are ones that have somehow transcended being Reformed or Lutheran or Catholic, and they're just Christian. And that's what I was going for.
And it had been so long since the Heidelberg Catechism had even crossed my mind. And for those that don't know it, what Traci's talking about is, the question is, what is your only comfort in life and death? And the line that I highlighted at the very beginning of the answer, that I am not my own, but belong with body and soul, both in life and in death, to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. And that's, for people that are familiar with it, for people, I think you wrote about how it's such a valuable thing, not only for people at the end of their life, but people that are suffering with, memory issues, Alzheimer's, dementia, that sort of thing. Just like a familiar hymn will be something that comforts them, a familiar catechism will as well. So you say it was a twist. It was a great twist, because there's nothing beats the creeds and the catechism. So I appreciated it. As we end here, I wanted to ask you if you would read something, and it's actually for people that, will get a book and they immediately flip to the end because they want to see how the story ends without investing in the story. This doesn't do that, but I think it's such a wonderful summative statement of everything that you cover. So I wonder if you'd read that last little section on page 188 for folks.
Yep. It is the very end, right before the acknowledgments, but no red bow. No red bow yet. It says, when things are going well, it's hard to know what might end up being most precious to us when we lack. In our personal lives, when things start to unravel, we need the common threads of faith. It is through these practices that God draws near. They are timeless. They are precious. I'll leave you with this. Therefore, my beloved, be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the work of the Lord, because you know that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. But also, true to the cry of my own spiritual heartbeat, the lyrics from a beloved hymn, the old rugged cross. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown.
That deserves a big amen. Thank you for that. So what's next for you?
Well, I have actually been writing now for about 9 years. And so throughout those years, you make different connections with writers. So I have a couple, and editors, et cetera, et cetera. I have a couple of projects that I haven't formally announced yet, but been doing some Bible study reflection is what I will call them. And those will be showing up in some various places. And I do have a book proposal that I have pretty much completed. They're never complete. Because the book's not written, but that proposal I am starting to work on sending to publishers and what have you. So yeah, more writing.
Great. And if people want to find out how the writing is going and connect with you and engage in these conversations and thoughtful dialogue that you bring about, how can folks follow you?
Well, if you're on Twitter, that has emerged as the number one way to kind of see daily interaction. It was not always that way, but I'd say probably for about the last 3 or 4 years it has been. And my handle there is Traces of Faith, which is also my blog name, tracesoffaith.com. And if you would like to kind of go back more to the beginning, every blog post is there that I've ever written, but in particular, there is a subheader that's called All the Churches. And that if that is of particular interest to you, it talks about my first time visiting an Orthodox church, my first time attending an Anglican church, those kind of what it's like to take communion with the Methodist is another article. So those kinds of blog posts will all be in that one space. And then I'm also on Instagram and Facebook, and those handles are Traces of Faith blog.
And I encourage everybody to follow along again, even if you just want to be a part of the silence of the conversations. There's so much you can get. The book is Shaky Ground. The author is Traci Rhoades. And Traci, I'm grateful for you being here again. Congratulations on being the first two-time guest.
Yes.
I was thinking, could I use the phrase two-timer? But no, I didn't think that would work well. So
return is probably better.
Return is better. But thank you for everything you're bringing, not only to bring some sanity to social media, but the thoughtful way that you're bringing so many people to reflect on their own faith journey. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks again for having me.